Rain is conducive to contemplation. Right? My name is Mick McCarthy, and I am pleased to serve as Dean of the Clouse School of Theology and Ministry here at Boston College. And on this rainy Saturday morning, I'm delighted to welcome you to the annual EVELYN Underhill Lecture in Christian Spirituality. I also want to take this opportunity to thank those who have made this morning possible, particularly our own continuing education team. Let's hear it for them. A word, though, on the lecture itself. The EVELYN Underhill Lecture in Christian Spirituality is an annual lecture that started in the year 2001 by the Boston College Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry, the IREPM. Since the year 2008, it has been continued by the now Clouse School of Theology and Ministry. And in fact, the lecture is one central element of our spirituality studies initiative here at the CSTM, which includes degree concentrations in spirituality, specialized certificates, and training and support for spiritual directors and for preachers. Over the years, the lecture has included the voices of Sandra Schneiders, Wilkie Au, Timothy Radcliffe, Richard Lenan, Elizabeth Johnson, Rowan Williams, Ilia Delio, Andra Prevost, and many other distinguished speakers. The lecture is named for the early 20th century mystic EVELYN Underhill, born in the year 1874, died in 1941. She was a married laywoman in ministry. She was the first woman invited to give a series of theological lectures at Oxford University, and was the first woman invited to lead clergy retreats in the Anglican Church. Widely recognized for her classic text, Mysticism, a comprehensive study of religious experience, Underhill authored numerous works on the Christian spiritual life that have become classics. She wrote as an evangelist for reality and was convinced that a practical mysticism was not for the few, the proud, and the brave, but was indeed within the reach of all. This year's Underhill lecturer is also an evangelist for reality, one who knows well the importance of contemplation in the midst of polarized times. And here to introduce our 2024 Underhill lecturer is the CSTM's Faculty Director of Spirituality Studies, Dr. Colleen Griffith.
Good morning. It's a true privilege to introduce our 2024 Underhill speaker, somebody widely considered to be one of the foremost theological voices to be reckoned with today, a gifted communicator with a compelling spiritual vision, a mature and constructive thinker whose deft coupling of theology and spirituality is exemplary. Brian Robinette is an associate professor of theology at Boston College. After receiving his PhD from the University of Notre Dame in 2003, he taught at St. Louis University for 9 years before moving to BC. He researches and teaches in the areas of systematic, philosophical, and spiritual theology, with special interests in theologies of creation, the doctrine of God, and contemplative practice. He is the author of over 25 academic articles, book chapters, and essays. His book, Grammars of Resurrection, A Christian Theology of Presence and Absence, received a first-place book award from the Catholic Press Association and a further first-place book award from the College Theology Society. His most recent book, The Difference Nothing Makes, Creation, Christ, Contemplation, was published in 2023 by the University of Notre Dame Press. Whether Brian is highlighting the contemplative aspects of theological inquiry that advance by way of unknowing, drawing from the field of mimetic theory to explicate facets of human desire, or mining the Christian tradition to amplify the dark night of faith. He consistently brings a mind invigorated by theological and philosophical exploration and a heart anchored in contemplative practice. A close friend and colleague of Brian's notes that, and I quote, "His theology is conceived and born in the matrix of contemplation." Indeed, the intellectual clarity, insight, and persuasiveness of the man rises from that space. A commitment to the contemplative abounds in his teaching as well. A doctoral student of Brian's has this to say about him: Brian senses the unfathomable mystery that each of his students carries. His pedagogical approach is one of delicacy, honoring our right to seek truth on our own terms and through our own growth. He does his utmost not to impose his ideas, lest he weigh on the development of our intelligence. Dr. Robinette has not only taught us, he has smoothed the rough edges of our minds with a most gentle hand. End of quote. It is hard to imagine higher praise for a teacher. And so we welcome into our midst today a celebrated scholar, a beloved teacher, our 2024 Underhill presenter, Brian Robinette.
So you made me cry. Thank you, Colleen, for those remarks, and thank you for reaching out to student and colleague and characterizing my work and my life in that way. I only hope that I actually can live up to what it is that you've given in portrait. I also thank you for inviting me to give this lecture, and I thank you for your leadership at the School of Theology and Ministry, the CLOW School of Theology and Ministry, I know is important to say. And also for your initiative with the spirituality program. So thank you. And also a great thanks to Dean McCarthy for his comments. And it's a real joy to be here with you at BC, and your leadership has been exemplary. And it's especially neat because we shared a little bit of time with one another overlapping as graduate students. So good to see you on this coast. Before I give my remarks, I want to acknowledge two men in my life who I regard as my spiritual benefactors. And evidence of their impact on me will be evident. The fact that they're influential on me will be evident in my remarks. The first one is Father Martin Laird, a Augustinian monk at Villanova University, and whose work has been massively influential on mine, and with whom I've been in dialogue, actually, about this lecture. And the second is Lama John McCransky, who is a good friend, great friend, and a colleague, and recently retired from BC, coming out of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and I will refer to him later in my remarks as well. But I regard both of them as supports for me and real mentors for me, and it is to them that I dedicate these remarks. Given the namesake of this lecture series, I wish to say a few words about my connection with the work of EVELYN Underhill. It is no exaggeration to say that her book, Mysticism, published in 1911, exerted a fateful influence on me during a volatile time of life. It was 1994, and I was 22 years of age, newly graduated from college, newly married, and miserable in my new job at an advertising agency. I had been browsing in a bookstore in Nashville, Tennessee, when Krista, my wife now of nearly 30 years, who is present here this morning, pulled a hefty volume off the shelf and said, "This seems like a book for you." This is that book. Now, there are several reasons why Krista might have said this to me after sizing up the book's contents, but chief among them was that she knew I was in the throes of an existential crisis that had me on a desperate search for spiritual guides. I will spare you the gory details of what precipitated this moment, but some months before my visit to the bookstore, I had found myself jolted straight out of a state of despair and uttering the word God again with a newfound obviousness. Set ablaze and spiritually promiscuous, I was visiting any Zen center, Quaker meeting, and monastery within a weekend's drive, just trying to get some handle on the raw energies unleashed within me. Now, it might seem that reading a book with the title Mysticism could only add fuel to the fire of youthful spiritual fervor. And in many respects, it is misleading to showcase religious savants in heightened states of consciousness as typical of the spiritual life, a life which is in fact one of growing sobriety. But for all of the romanticism with which the author's voice speaks, and EVELYN Underhill was just in her mid-30s when she wrote this text, what is notable about it is its compelling engagement with the psychology and philosophy of its day, and the charting of an itinerary drawn from a broad swath of Christian mystics and saints. And this is what it most gave me: a vibrant sense of the intellectual and contemplative riches of Christian faith, and a thorough acquaintance with such figures as Augustine, Suda Dionysius, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, Meister Eckhart, Jan van Roosebrugge, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, etc. In short, Underhill's mysticism would prove decisive for my return to Christian faith. I now had a path and a host of spiritual benefactors to guide me. Drawing closer to the theme of my lecture today, it is notable that following the 1911 publication of Mysticism, Underhill would publish a shorter volume entitled Practical Mysticism in 1914, which aimed to provide preliminary instructions for the contemplative way, eliminating all discussion of abnormal states of consciousness and mystical genius, as she puts it. She charts a course for practically minded readers. It is ordinary contemplation that now concerns her, and an invitation for lay men and women living in a world of action. Writing the preface during the outbreak of the First World War, she acknowledges how irresponsible it might seem to write of contemplation when the whole world finds itself in a state of violent conflagration. What role could contemplation possibly have during a time of war? In fact, Underhill considered postponing the publication of Practical Mysticism, thinking it would be better received during a time of relative stability. But she rightly resisted, as this would only concede the point and reduce contemplation to the status of a spiritual plaything. Even a cursory study of the Christian mystical tradition, she observes, reveals that its greatest exemplars and artifacts were forged during times of great distress. That, quote, the stronger the forces of destruction appeared, the more intense grew the spiritual vision which opposed them, end quote. Far from buffering us from the harsh realities of life, contemplation entails a deepening capacity for entering those realities with clarity, equanimity, and loving compassion. Nothing could be more practical, that is to say, needful, or even revolutionary, than contemplative awakening when the whole world seems unhinged. And this is essentially my thesis today. If you have a handout, I'm moving along. This is the next section, Ressentiment and Affective Polarization. Beyond the reactive mind, Christian contemplative practice in polarized times. Perhaps I might have gone with a punchier subtitle, Christian contemplative practice during an election year. But polarized times will suffice, I hope, to name the prevailing mood we find ourselves in, as well as the timeliness of addressing it. One way to further characterize this mood is to borrow a phrase from Pankaj Mishra, an Indian essayist and novelist who describes ours as an age of anger. By this is meant a time of pervasive resentment, not just in the US, but across the globe. Drawing upon social science, literature, and art, Mishra inquires into the existential significance of our age. How does it feel to live in a time of massive social upheaval, ecological precarity, accelerating technological change, and constant surveillance? What is it like to undergo this suffocating sense of the world? And how might we metabolize the various feeling states it produces and not grow overreactive, overwhelmed, or just plain numb? In 1968, the philosopher Hannah Arendt could declare that, quote, every country has become the almost immediate neighbor of every other country, and every man feels the shock of events which take place at the other end of the globe, end quote. How much truer is this statement at a time when we can doom scroll through the news feeds of our phones each morning to learn about the newest despotic outburst, the latest climate disaster, the most recent threat of nuclear war, or the hottest insults chucked back and forth between our so-called world leaders, all before breakfast? Drawing upon Arendt, as well as Friedrich Nietzsche, Mishra observes that the pressure cooker of our times can make it seem that everyone is against everybody all the time, a condition we might summarize as ressentiment. And I'm quoting Mishra now, and it's on your handout. An existential resentment of the other people's being, caused by an intense mix of envy and sense of humiliation and powerlessness. Ressentiment, as it lingers and deepens, poisons civil society and undermines political liberty, and is presently making for a global turn to authoritarianism and toxic forms of chauvinism, end quote. This lurch towards authoritarianism is a clear symptom of wide-scale political and ideological polarization, which now seeps into nearly every pore of interpersonal and social life. Everyone, maybe you've noticed, must take sides in our town halls and city streets, in our local school boards, in our university campuses, in our news programming and social media platforms, which are algorithmized to emotionally hijack us with fear, rage, and contempt. Places of worship are hardly untouched by this taking sideism and can exhibit some of its most vitriolic forms. As a recent report from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops put it, polarization has made virtually every affinity group within the church, whether conservative or liberal or somewhere in between, feeling an unprecedented level of, the words are, animosity and feeling judged by others. A term of art used by social scientists that capture this dynamic is affective polarization. Given how social our species is, we are naturally drawn towards affinity groups to acquire a sense of self or shared identity, which we typically distinguish from some other. While this self-other differentiation can assume benign forms and even achieve degrees of mutual enrichment, as in the case of friendly competition, a dangerous phase shift occurs as we identify ourselves over and against the other. The boundaries of self and other get tightly drawn, become tenacious and clingy, and with a strong affective charge. Positive feelings towards those in our in-group become intensified by our negative feelings towards those in an out-group. The sense of fellow feeling we have with those like us gains a higher pitch as we share animosity towards those who are deemed unlike us. Our otherwise tenuous identities feel more assured to the degree we have a common enemy against which to define ourselves. With affective polarization, those with whom we disagree are not just different from us, but disgusting. They are not just competitors, but contaminants. They fix our joint attention for their depravity and idiocy. We are not just opposed to them, but hold them in contempt, just as we feel their contempt. With a politics of disgust in full swing, our agendas become defined by defeating the other. It's not just that we have our values, we must stop theirs from advancing. And given the stakes involved, our nation's purity, our church's integrity, our civilization's security, we are justified in using less than savory means to prevail. Long gone is the time for checking our biases and examining our hypocrisies. We must band together, remain fully ensconced in our echo chambers, where our sentiments, language, and behavioral patterns can be tightly groomed. A telltale sign that affective polarization has taken root is when we feel an intoxicating mixture of envy and contempt. We want what the other seems to have, say, political power or some social advantage, but we hold them in contempt for possessing it, or possessing it in the wrong way. We may declare their tactics revolting and their values debased, but we covet their influence and paradoxically begin to mirror them in our rivalry. We resent them, feel less powerful because of them, but we secretly wish to be like them and are incapable of getting them off of our minds, where they live rent-free. Becoming a contemplative humanity. Next section. Now, if the brief sketch I've provided sounds familiar, we might wonder whether the problem of polarization represents much new at all. Aren't the dynamics of in-group, out-group rivalry a perennial problem for our species? When haven't we been subject to reactivity and grievance, to making enemies and falling into cycles of recrimination, to scapegoating others to achieve unanimity and purity for our tribe, our nation state, our party's cause? Aren't these dynamics so recurrent in our history as to nearly define us as a species? In many respects, nothing is new in what I have portrayed. Read any fair-minded book of history or cultural anthropology. Read Dostoevsky or a Shakespeare play. Read the book of Genesis or the Epic of Gilgamesh. What do we find? Evidence of a conflictual species learning how to be human without projecting internal dysfunction upon some other to achieve group solidarity. It's the oldest play in the book. What is new is the scale of the problem, driven largely by our accelerated technological capacities and their planetary reach. With the exponential increase in the power of our weaponry, along with the crisis in sense-making due to the fragmentation of our media ecology, there is good reason to think we are approaching an inflection point for our species. With the technical capacities we now possess, but which increasingly seem to possess us, the experiment of being human seems to hang in the balance like never before. As Thomas Merton wrote in the late 1960s, in the shadow of the atomic bomb, and this quote is on your handout, "We have more power at our disposal today than we ever had, and yet we are more alienated and estranged from the inner ground of meaning and love than we have ever been. The result of this is evident. We are living through the greatest crisis in the history of man. And this crisis is centered precisely in the country, America, this time, that has made a fetish out of action and has lost or perhaps never had the sense of contemplation. Far from being irrelevant, prayer, meditation, and contemplation are of the utmost importance in America today." Perhaps Merton's appeal to contemplation in this context will seem absurdly off-point. Given the enormity of the issues we face, what use could we have of contemplative practice? Might the recommendation to become more mindful, which is kind of the rage today, make matters worse, as it would only make us better adjusted to social realities in desperate need of change? But for Merton, who was then living in a hermitage at the edge of a monastery in rural Kentucky, What makes contemplation so vital today is precisely its uselessness. When so much of our lives must check a box, meet an external demand, be neatly packaged, have high impact, or solve a technical problem, we can be quite sure we are living in ways hostile to the contemplative mood, and thus alienated from the inner ground of meaning and love. So much that has come to define our culture, not least the erosion of our capacities for attention through the worship of the latest dopamine hit, militates against the expansive and pacific awareness that is the hallmark of contemplation. But it is precisely this deeper awareness that makes contemplative awakening so revolutionary for our times. As the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, insists, and this is on your handout, quote, "To put it boldly, contemplation is the only ultimate answer to the unreal and insane world that our financial systems and our advertising culture and our chaotic and unexamined emotions encourage us to inhabit. To learn contemplative practice is to learn what we need so as to live truthfully and honestly and lovingly. It is a deeply revolutionary matter," end quote. Williams offered these comments in 2012 to the Synod of Catholic Bishops in Rome, where he stressed the importance of becoming a contemplative humanity as a sign of maturity in Christian life. Contemplation is not reserved for a special class of aspirants or certain personality types. We are all called to be contemplatives as the fruition of a constitutive capacity we have for God. The more we are awakened unto God, the more truly human we become. And the more human we become, the less we will succumb to the reactive patterns, reductive judgments, and neurotic projections so characteristic of our polarized times. Contemplation has nothing to do with exotic or private experiences, which would only amount to spiritual materialism, but entails an awakening process that allows us to perceive one another and the whole of creation in the light of divine wisdom. We begin to recognize creation for what it really is, sacramental, imbued with divine presence, rather than a mere collection of things subject to narrow and instrumental aims. We grow in freedom from the brutal reductionisms that characterize much modern life, and thus we collaborate in the redemption of a creation groaning in travail. Seen in this way, contemplation is not just one kind of thing that Christians do. It is, as Williams suggests, quote, "key to prayer, liturgy, art, and ethics, the key to the essence of a renewed humanity that is capable of seeing the world and other subjects in the world with freedom. Freedom from self-oriented acquisitive habits and distorted understanding that comes from them," end quote. Beyond the reactive mind, next section. To gain a better sense for what this freedom entails, I would like to focus this discussion of polarization on the way it courses through our hearts and minds, where it ramifies as in a vicious feedback loop. As Thomas Merton writes in his book, No Man is an Island, quote, "A man who is not at peace with himself necessarily projects his interior fighting onto the society of those he lives with and spreads a contagion of conflict all around him," end quote. Here, I'd like to suggest that the core problem of polarization is not them, or even the culture, or the system, but the dysfunction of our own minds. And unless we inquire into this dysfunction, which is inmost to us, then we stand little chance of properly understanding polarization, much less addressing it. And so here, in sum, is how I would like to put it. This is a diagnostic. We perpetually find ourselves, mostly unconsciously, reacting out of fear. Fear of the ceaseless flow of reality, fear of the vast depths of our own being, fear of our feelings, fear of others, fear of death. Not knowing what ultimately to trust or whether to trust, we retreat into limiting constructions of identity that we imagine are comprehensible and permanent. We curve in on ourselves, or as St. Augustine put it, incurvatus in se, curve in on ourselves and grasp at a reified sense of self, whether individually or in groups, which we struggle to prop up and defend, but always at the expense of a more fundamental truth. There is no self separate from the other. And there is no self separate from the unconditioned source and ground of our being. Yet in the face of the ceaseless flow of experience, as well as the inexhaustible mystery of God, in whom we live and move and have our being, we superimpose schemas, reductive labels, and narrow categories for what are inherently interdependent and dynamic relations. We cling to the tiny little islands of our knowing rather than relax into a gracious, ever-expansive unknowing, which entails its own intelligence and wisdom, as we shall see. If at one level it is appropriate and even needful to make some distinctions between self and other, or between this thing and that thing, the problem is that we can constantly mistake these distinctions for ultimate reality. We are perpetually seduced into believing that our affective registrations and conceptual representations of phenomena capture their reality, and thus we reduce ourselves, other persons, and even God into something to be grasped. This is the essence of idolatry, this grasping, and it occurs on many scales in human relations. It occurs on the interpersonal level, where we treat our distinctions of self and other as stable and comprehensible, often by way of contrast and with the ever-present threat of conflict. And it occurs on the social level through the construction of in-groups in contrast with out-groups that define yet threaten our identity. In other words, clinging to self assumes collective, not just individualized forms, and becomes established as social, institutional, and cultural habits. Conflictual relations become sedimented in our history, only to replicate themselves at higher levels of organization. That is, they become systemic, larger-than-life forces that are regenerated through social conditioning. This is the reactive mind at large. This phrase, the reactive mind, comes from Martin Laird, an Augustinian monk and patristic professor at Villanova. Drawing from the Christian desert monastic tradition, Laird homes in on the microdramas of the mind and their outsized impact on our relationship with others and with God. A nearly constant flow of emotive and ideational content courses through our minds, springing forth in largely automatic fashion. We are seldom present to ourselves, truly present, but get caught up in virtual inner worlds produced by a steady stream of reactive, affective patterns and unconscious judgments. We don't notice this stream most of the time because we are so absorbed by it. In the same way we grow accustomed to the sound of traffic through exposure, we become habituated to the drone-like noise produced by our minds. Until, that is, those moments of clarity and inner stillness that reveal to us just how chock full of clutter our minds really are. More typically, however, the reactive mind prattles on, and with it a haze of semi-consciousness leading to heedless lives. In a culture that is habituated by frenetic activity and the need to acquire, to strive, and prove oneself worthy of love, Our default mental states become a swarm of repetitive patterns playing scripts for us to follow, but which alienate us from the inner depths of freedom. As Laird puts it, and this is on your handout, reactive mind is characterized by a compulsion to acquire as well as a throttling need to progress toward mastery. It is what we embarrassingly call our normal way of life, shaped by a culture that feeds on compulsion, consumption, conquest, credit, and cash. Reactive mind serves to keep God at bay even as we desire God all the same. Inconsistency and contradictions are its daily bread. Laird's typology is not meant to refer to a component of the human being. It's not as though the reactive mind is a discrete organ we might locate and dissect. Rather, it is a shadow self, a sense of self that may seem very real to us, but which is an alienated projection drawn from constant comparison with others. Indeed, we typically derive our sense of identity from what others make us to be. We take on the desires, images, social scripts, and behavioral patterns of those around us, internalize them and replicate them, and with little conscious awareness or creative resistance to them. As Laird observes, quote, ego can only think in groupthink and speak only in group speak. The danger here is that this derived identity through comparison allows us to establish rivalrous relationships that open the doorway to violence, whether on a small scale or on far grander ones, end quote. Notice in this succinct assessment the ease with which rivalrous relations on the interpersonal level shift to larger scales. This shifting back and forth is something we should expect, given the interdependent character of reality. And it is also why any meaningful social change requires creative intervention on the personal level, not least the psychodramas of our hearts and minds. For somehow, at some point, we need to learn how to withdraw our cooperation from these dynamics and discover for ourselves a way of knowing and loving that runs deeper than the reactive mind. The micro practices of contemplative awakening must go hand in hand with the macro practices of social change. We often talk of the latter, but rarely do we take the former seriously or even consider them. Contemplative awakening. If anything can be said of contemplative practice, we might describe it as a shift from reactivity to receptivity. This entails a fundamental choice, a withdrawal or release from the clutches of reactive mind. There is a renunciative element here, and all ascetical practices should really be understood as having this as their goal. But much more is involved than withdrawal. It is discovery, a discovery empowered by a wisdom and intelligence that flows from hidden depths. We are cooperating with a gracious reality that is prior to our egoic constructions and which silently calls to us. Should we wish to gain some coherence in our lives or purity of heart, we need to pay attention to ourselves, as ancient philosophers and monastics put it. This is the mother of all spiritual practice: paying attention, being present, beholding. And it constitutes nothing less than a revolutionary act. It is not about generating new experiences, not even mystical experiences, but a shift in how we relate to all our experience. It entails an attitudinal openness that permits the content of our experience to be, rather than always being caught up in it, trying to manage it, fight it, parse it, package it, and in general being at war with ourselves. As we approach the practice of stillness with some diligence, perhaps through connection with sacred spaces and time, through the assistance of the breath, with a simple prayer word or an icon to give light focus. We may return to ourselves and become present to the sheer gift of this moment, the only moment there really is. We will sense more and more space within our experience, gaps between perceptions, feelings, and thoughts. And perhaps these gaps, which frighten us at first, will seem increasingly inviting and safe. We grow just a little more familiar with a quality of awareness that is not just another perception or feeling or thought. We sense an openness, a depth, a living stillness that gives pasture to all our perceptions, feelings, and thoughts. More room for them to be and to settle, to unwind. As Teresa of Avila puts it in her Interior Castle, and I have some quotes on the handout, through the practice of recollection, it's a contemplative practice, which gently draws the heart and mind inward, we come to wait with quiet expectancy. We grow familiar with an inner depth we scarcely noticed before. The surface mind may be clacking away. She uses this image of clacking of the mind. But the prayer of recollection disposes us to a profound peace and sweetness, quote, in the very interior part of ourselves. She says, I think this must be the center of the soul. A center that is not contracted, but dilated, as it, quote, swells and expands our whole interior being, producing ineffable blessings. We might not quite understand how this happens, she notes, but it happens graciously and of its own accord. Now, lest this statement by Teresa makes contemplation seem so rarefied as to be irrelevant to ordinary life, let me suggest that this gift of expansive awareness is so readily available, so immediately present to us, that we tend to look over it all the time. It's not that contemplative knowing is an extraordinary mystical state of consciousness that stands above and beyond ordinary experiences. This deeper awareness is available to us all the time, at the very root of our being, but obscured through the accretions of emotionally laden thought patterns that polarize consciousness. Such deeper knowing has only to be revealed or unveiled rather than manufactured, which is why the most characteristic feature of contemplative practice is one of opening and allowing, of receiving and beholding, of unknowing. While seemingly passive when compared to modes of knowing that depend upon acquisition, contemplative knowing is an activity of the profoundest sort, a free and utterly awake engagement with whatever is present, just as it is. To gain a better sense of this process of unknowing, allow me to read an extended passage by Martin Laird, and on your handout. Contemplative practice doesn't acquire anything. In that sense, and in an important sense, it is not a technique, but a surrendering of deeply embedded resistances that allows the sacred within gradually to reveal itself as a simple fundamental fact. We discover in the process that there is more depth within us than we ever dreamt. There is not only chaos, confusion, emotional attachment, anxiety, and anger's nettled memory, not just a marvel of discursive reason, imaginative insight, and unconscious insight, but also an abyss of awareness that is always flowing with bright obscurity, grounding all these mental processes, one with all and one with God. End quote. A few features of this passage. The first is that in no way is this deeper awareness arrived at through egoic striving. The fundamental disposition here is one of willingness. There is a nakedness of intention here, a simple act of hushed expectancy and alertness that is fully engaged yet non-possessive. In the climate of contemplative practice, we come to recognize that amid the perceptions, feelings, and thought patterns swarming and buzzing through our consciousness, there remains a basic luminous awareness that is utterly pacific, welcoming, and grounding. This is almost impossible for us to believe at first, because normally we are so riveted by the content of our experience as it disperses attention this way and that. We don't typically recognize that underlying such dispersal is an ineffable yet unfailing presence of wholeness. Like a fish that does not suspect the water in which it swims, we remain unaware of the inherently open and radiant awareness that allows for anything like experience at all, and which connects us to all reality, including the source and ground of reality. This is not to suggest that the ever-shifting content of experience is something to be gotten rid of or suppressed. And there is no need to vilify the reactive mind or pathologize the ego. All of this represents an ongoing war with ourselves. But it is to point out that the stream of feelings and thoughts so often dominant in our lives arises out of, without ever exhausting, the vast silent depths in which we live and move and have our being. To recognize this depth dimension is among the most revolutionary discoveries we could ever have. God does not know how to be absent, writes Martin Laird. Yes, it is true that most of us experience alienation from the ground of our being much of the time. Yet such separation is the great illusion in which we are caught. We get caught or trapped in our fragmented experience, in our thought patterns and emotional entanglements, in our identity building projects, in our projections upon others, and others' projections upon us. And perhaps we imagine God as some object over there, in the distance, needing our guilt-ridden efforts to become worthy of love. Or perhaps God doesn't register as any point of concern at all, a mere fantasy. Whatever we may presently think about God, the Christian tradition does not regard God as some big other hovering at the edge of the empirical universe, occasionally intervening here and there, if at all. God is the ineffable source and ground of all that is, and thus intimately present to all that is, nearer to us than we are to ourselves, as St. Augustine puts it. If we have grown accustomed to the illusion of separateness from God, from each other, from ourselves, from the whole of created reality, then what we most need is the dispelling of this illusion. A quiet, if pervasive sense that who and what we are is rooted in an unconditioned reality that gives all things their shared being. Final section, beyond polarization. In the final part of my lecture this morning, I return to the theme of polarization and wish to offer 3 recommendations for bringing contemplative practice more concretely into the mix. As I do, however, I should make clear that there is not a contemplative solution to any problem. If anything, contemplation should be approached by recognizing the limits of our cleverness and demand for results. This doesn't mean that contemplation has nothing to do with social change, but we should be wary of instrumentalizing the spiritual life, lest the contagion of our egoic ambitions and doctrinaire prejudices assume the pretense of piety. The first suggestion entails a renunciation. Give up resentment. Renounce resentment. We must work through the layers of resentment in our lives. Resentment towards the being of others, resentment towards the system, resentment towards those people or the church. even resentment towards our own reactive minds, which only amplifies them. There is a line from Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation that has long spoken to me. May it speak to you. The quote is this: "The most difficult and the most necessary of renunciations, to give up resentment." If ever there were a Lenten observance for our polarized times, it is this: give up resentment. Merton observes that the tendency to blame others for our discontents ends up blocking insight into where genuine freedom is found. With our minds fixed on those people, the system, we look right past the inner landscape of our psychic projections and reactive mental states. We fail to notice how we construct virtual worlds where reductive judgments of others run riot. The habit of blaming others becomes a feedback loop, metastasizes, and produces a shadow self that feeds on offense, scandal, and outrage to survive. Complaining, name-calling, fault-finding, indignant sighing, compulsively needing to be right. These are just some of the marks of the resentful mind, which is liable to spin stories and even full-blown conspiracies at the blink of an eye. Resentment is addictive, which is why Merton stresses renunciation. If you want to renounce resentment, he writes, you have to renounce the shadow self that feels itself menaced by the confusion without which it cannot subsist. In other words, one just doesn't renounce resentment. There must be an inquiry into the shadow self that produces and hosts it. I'll quote, and this quote is on your handout. What if we discovered that we are, in fact, already free? It is not that someone else is preventing you from living happily. You yourself do not know what you want. Rather than admit this, you pretend that someone is keeping you from exercising your liberty. Who is this? It is you yourself. Merton is not espousing a vapid individualism here. He is not claiming that we can wrest ourselves from the chronic tendency to blame others for our discontents. As he hastens to add, it is our acceptance of God's unconditional freedom that delivers us from the tyranny of resentment. Only by opening to the source and ground of our being, and by discovering where our true worth originates, might we be released from the shadow self that subsists from resentment. Renunciation is not merely withdrawal. It is the discovery of our inmost worth as loved into being by God. And this leads me to my second suggestion, which has to do with the world of feelings. The abyss of awareness to which Laird refers should not be imagined as a terrifying freefall into a void. Though it may seem that way from the perspective of egoic striving, in fact, this depth of awareness is where true safety is found. As we relax into this depth, allowing ourselves to graciously fall apart in it, we discover a spacious quality that allows our feelings and thoughts to be present without reacting to them. This being present is, in fact, a basic kindness, a simple warmth that allows feeling and thought patterns to unwind and express a deeper wisdom and compassion. Here I wish to acknowledge what I've learned from other contemplative traditions, that is, outside of Christianity, especially the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which has much to teach Christians. There is great need in our time for learning how to be with our feelings, to work wisely with them, whatever their intensity, tonality, and texture. This, too, is a revolutionary act, since most of the time we are either acting out our feelings without really knowing it, or we repress our feelings as a defense against them. We are often afraid of our feelings, especially strong emotion, and without resources for accommodating them. But here lies a remarkable opportunity for accessing resources for joy and compassion. All of us in this room have felt various shades of resentment, anger, and despair over the seemingly intractable problems of our time. And just as likely, we have gone through or will go through stretches of empathic distress or burnout as a result. But as my friend and former Boston College colleague Lama John McCransky notes in his Awakening Through Love, being present to our sufferings with a heart of compassion allows that suffering to be a source of wisdom and regeneration for ourselves and for others. This is a highly counterintuitive claim, since the idea of being open to the suffering of others seems only to compound our own. But what McCransky means here is not a duplicating process. He is referring to a contemplative wisdom that allows us to look deeply into our own sufferings with open awareness as an acknowledgement and kindness, but without being swallowed up by it. Kindness to suffering? Yes. Because the more we repress our suffering or run away from it, the more reactive we become to it, and thus the more our suffering grows. But as we allow ourselves to be present to our suffering, really present to our feelings of despair or numbness, to our anger or fear, to our resentment, then we allow for a wisdom and compassion to issue forth that proves deeper than all such feelings and reactive thought patterns. What is remarkable is that as our capacity for accommodating our own suffering grows, to that extent we can be present to the suffering of others. There is a direct, not inverse, relation here. More remarkable yet, the more present we are to our suffering from within this deeper compassion and wisdom, the more equanimity and joyous connection with others we will sense in its midst. We will grow in our capacity to move towards others in their suffering rather than aversive towards them, from them, with a strong wish for their well-being and with a dawning recognition of our shared goodness. My third and final suggestion concerns the commitment to living in truth. I wish to make clear that the appeal to contemplative unknowing has nothing to do with complacency or fuzzy thinking. The attitudinal generosity of the contemplative mind should not be mistaken for naive optimism or a platitudinous everything belongs, which may only hide despair. Critique is also part of the package, along with clarifying distinctions, and not infrequently a resounding no. One has only to think of the example of Merton himself, whose writings throughout the 1960s were much occupied with social analysis and protest on a wide range of issues: the Vietnam War, racial violence, rampant consumerism, American imperialism, and the modern cult of technological progress. If there is a legitimate mysticism for our times, it can only be a mysticism of open eyes, to borrow a phrase from Johann Baptist Metz. Along these lines, we should not imagine the talk of letting be and allowing to suggest withdrawal from action in the world. In fact, it is precisely our seeing through the simulacra of the reactive mind that allows us to welcome uncomfortable truths and act accordingly. As EVELYN Underhill puts it in the conclusion of Practical Mysticism, the contemplative life is about becoming more real. Far from turning us into mere bystanders, it strengthens our sense of personhood, which is very different from striving to be an individual or being swallowed up by the crowd spirit. Contemplative awakening has to do with clarity and sobriety, not irrational exuberance, and thus it assists us in becoming genuinely responsive to the world. She writes, and I think this is on your handout, "It is in action that contemplatives find their truest and safest point of insertion into the living, active world of reality." See, she has that word, capital R, reality, that was referred to earlier. For them, contemplation and action are not opposites, but two interdependent forms of a life that is one, end quote. In a time of widespread polarization, the practice of unknowing can help us remain open to others with whom we strongly disagree. As we become less hostage to well-worn scripts and automatic judgments, we grow more receptive to truths we might stubbornly suppress or regard as insignificant. We become more open to ambiguity, uncertainty, and paradox, more alert to our biases and defense mechanisms, but also more confident in making reasoned judgments when the time comes. Contemplative unknowing is not anti-intellectual, but rather it expands the remit of reason. As Maggie Ross puts it, unknowing entails a surpassing of excessive self-consciousness and a linear rationality so that, quote, a larger, holistic, directly perceiving rationality of the deep mind can come to the fore, end quote. Whereas a mind conditioned by contrastive thinking will only be able to see alternatives between unity and diversity, or between self and other, the receptive mind will sense in them a living betweenness and dynamic coherence. To this extent, the way of unknowing invites open-ended dialogue where there are conceptual impasses. It will be open to learning from the other and sensing the values with which they operate, rather than dismissing them with contempt. And while we may continue to disagree, even quite vigorously at times, to the extent we model intellectual generosity and communicate loving openness, we just may win their friendship rather than just trying to win. And that, my friends, would be the true sign that we are moving beyond the polarized mind. As Martin Luther King Jr. puts it, we must not seek to defeat or humiliate the enemy, but to win their friendship and understanding. Quote. This is not a sentimental love or a Pollyannish attitude towards the reality of conflict, but it is a view that springs from the conviction that our humanity is shared, confident that no matter how fractious or alienating we may become, we already belong to one another, trusting that despite the many reasons we may adduce for saying no to one another, there is a primordial yes that has brought us into being and which empowers us to say yes to one another from hidden depths, hoping that we will all be friends with one another one day because we are called to be friends with God. Thank you.
What a tour de force, huh? I know Megan De Dios is going to say more about this, but you'll have the good fortune of returning to this lecture in a few weeks to be able to hear it again. I know I'll be returning to it. Thank you, Brian. Let's sit for a moment in just quiet, following Brian's lead, to check in with ourselves in that deeper, more expansive place, and to ask what it is we heard, what it is we felt, and why it so matters. And I invite you now to turn to the person next to you. Perhaps you traveled in with them, perhaps it's a new friend, and to just have a couple minutes conversation. What is it that you heard? What is it that you felt? Why does it matter so? All right, we're going to take about 10 minutes or so to continue with Brian in conversation. And I'd ask you if you have a comment, point of resonance that you'd like to share, or a question for Brian, to keep it to about a half a minute so that we can hear from as many voices as possible. So we'll be starting on this side, and we'll just go right side, left side, right side, left side. How does that sound? Brian, come on back.
Hi, I'm a Weston Jesuit grad. I'm actually a parish pastor and a parent of an 18-year-old, and I'm also have a tiny role at Harvard Divinity School. So this was really rich, and I'm listening to it through the lens of as a parent, a pastor, an accompanier of students studying in a really multi-faith environment about how this helps, and I guess it's a kind of a question, when we are demanded to hold someone's trauma and to see, no, but you have to see. If you could only see from my perspective how awful this is. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. May I restate the question to make sure that I understand? How to be present to others when they are dealing with the affliction of trauma. How is that possible? Is that basically the question? Well, yes, I think, first of all, this is related to the second recommendation that I elaborated. We have to be present to, if we don't have trauma in our own lives, we definitely have to be present to the suffering in our own lives. We have to know how to do that. Because what happens if you're with others who are dealing with suffering, traumatic or otherwise, if your own suffering has not been processed or is able to be held in some way, then that's going to interact, it's going to trigger, and you might find yourself recoiling, or you might find yourself saying things or being in certain ways that are not helpful, not appropriate to those who are dealing with these things. And so what does it mean to be present to one's suffering? Of course, it's just nothing other than becoming utterly wide open and allowing those feelings, suffering, or thought patterns to simply be present without recoiling from them or without trying to manage them. And I think that there's a wisdom that grows that allows us to be present to others, even if it is traumatic.
Thank you. Somebody come over here. Please.
Uh-oh.
Hey, Brian, thank you for the great talk. I always learn a lot from you, but I always have questions. And my question is whether we can have non-reactive fear, non-reactive anger, sadness, resentment. I'll just look at resentment for a second, within 30 seconds.
Good.
Resentment is a negative emotional reaction to the perception one has been treated unjustly.
Yep.
And it can come in healthy and unhealthy forms, just and unjust forms, mistaken and correct forms. And in some ways, resentment is an affirmation of one's own self-worth. Mm-hmm. When one has been denigrated, or disrespected, treated badly, injured. So I wonder if it wouldn't be better that instead of saying, let's banish all resentment, to say, let's move away from reactive resentment toward responsive resentment. That is one not coming out of irrational, inappropriate grievance, but one that tries to figure out using practical reason, now I've been treated unjustly, what should I do about it? Yeah. Not to fuel hatred, but in a way to say, I'm going to be resentful, but I want to do something about it. It's especially hard when people don't acknowledge they've treated you badly, right? Mm-hmm. So can I ask for an adjective, which is, let's banish inappropriate resentment or reactive resentment, but not resentment altogether.
I'm happy to, The reason why I said uh-oh is just because Steve and I are such good friends and share so much and often have these kinds of conversations. And it meant I can't wait to hear what he has to say. I think maybe much depends on just simply how we parse language. So the running definition of resentment for me is related to contempt. There's a contempt for the other person's being, a resent that they exist at all. So I might want to reserve the term resentment for that, but the point about anger and legitimate use and acceptance and working out of anger is a very important point. And I think that it would be a mistake to imagine that the contemplative mood is simply not feeling anger or treating it as though it shouldn't exist there. Because I do think that anger has an intelligence to it, even though it can get out of hand and lead to all sorts of reciprocity with others so that you kind of basically lose control, kind of get caught up. But anger has an intelligence to it. It says that ought not be, and there ought to be another way. And so I think that we have to honor the intelligence of our feeling states rather than, so resentment renunciation of resentment might mean let's access the intelligence and the motive force of our anger and use it wisely, but we do need to be very careful to the ways in which that can so easily slip into contempt for another person's being. But I see the point totally.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I do want to stipulate that this is more in a Catholic context, but I'm sure it has implications for everyone. In his book, The Nature and Mission of Theology, Joseph Ratzinger talks about kind of a two-pointed analysis of Christian unity, of specifically Catholic unity, where he calls for plurality in the realm of praxeological discussion, but for unity based in Scripture and magisterial authority in the realms of non-negotiable points of faith. Mm-hmm. In the context of what you said today, how do you see the role of Scripture and magisterial authority and then discussions among the faithful in the realms of things that aren't as clear as certain elements of faith in preserving us from polarization?
Good. So thank you for that question. One thing to make clear, I hope it's clear, that contemplative practice is not done in the abstract or in the general, but should be rooted in communities and traditions. And those traditions make a difference. It's not just that they're window dressing, that the traditions are just mere placeholders for something else called contemplative wisdom. So the contemplative active life will look differently as expressed through these various commitments. And part of those various commitments, to speak of the Catholic tradition, is that it does, of course, have tradition rooted in Scripture and magisterial teachings, doctrine, life practices, etc., etc. And so I think it is very important to become open to learn and to discover oneself within the wisdom that tradition conveys. And in many respects, I think that those who are more contemplative in their practice aren't usually so caught up about doctrinal differences. They see the depth of those and the practical use of them. Maybe less, though, preoccupied with certain conceptual understandings of doctrine, and more the lived character of those doctrines as they show up in communities might be one way to address. But I do think it entails a certain kind of humility in community to listen to the wisdom of that community. But part of that wisdom also means being able to question it and to discern its further implications. And that, of course, involves disagreement. And that's when some kind of capacity to be present to the others who have different interpretations than you may have becomes really crucial.
Thank you. We have time for one more. And if you have a question that you have not gotten a chance to raise, we're going to have some reception time with Brian as well. Yourself.
Hi. So the Catholic Church is in the middle of this giant synod thing, right? This multi-year process.
Uh-oh,
and
this is a real uh-oh. Am I supposed to say something about the synod?
It's okay if you don't know too much about it. But at the heart of what the church is discerning is how our structures and way of organizing ourselves can better facilitate the exercise of co-responsibility on the part of all the baptized to live out the gospel mission.
Yeah.
And this seems like it would be a real benefit to many of us in living out the gospel mission. And I wonder, do you have a sense of how the church can facilitate that, like in the midst of this conversation about how do we structure life? What does power look like in the church? All these big questions. What's the role of the church in helping people to access this kind of practice?
One thing I want to say immediately is that I think it is an unmitigated disaster that the contemplative riches of the tradition have not really been made so available to ordinary laymen and women. It's seldom referred to in those places where it could actually be heard. And I don't know exactly how to give the broad diagnostic of how that came to be, but I do think it's a disaster. I don't mean a disaster, that sounds overblown. I just mean it's an impoverishment. Nevertheless, I do think that from the pulpit, through various kinds of parish activities, through the classroom, through families, through instruction, various kinds of things, these practices really ought to be known and not seen as exotic or something that those folks do, the professionals, the monks, or certain personality types, like where you show up on the Enneagram. Like, okay, you must be more of a contemplative because you are a what? I don't know, a 9? Is that right, I guess? So that is something I think that people who are involved in education and formation and ministry should really become more attentive to. And just to give you an example of what this is for me, is that in the classroom, when I, here at BC, when I teach, and I have all kinds of students come through. Obviously, they're certainly kind of disposed to something that would happen at BC, or else they wouldn't be here. But many of them come into the classroom with a kind of tin ear with respect to religious things. Once they catch a whiff of these kinds of practices, this sort of depth dimension, it has the effect of inviting them to perceive things in the tradition or questions about God quite differently. That's just an indication of how even a little bit can go a long way. Anyway, there just should be more of a commitment to it, and there are many ways in which that can show up.
Again, thank you for bringing up.
Thank you. Thanks, Connie.